With regard to 13 rooms in Santiago, Sierra in particular, living sculptures and interactive pieces and in-your-face performances tend to make me squirm as a matter of course. I just don't feel right staring at other people, so you can imagine this morning's exercise was difficult for me. And I don't like eavesdropping on conversation, so that's harder and harder these days with mobile phones. And I certainly don't like talking about people behind their back. The curators have declared that the doors are crucial to the experience in 13 rooms, and I just hate going through a door without knocking. And even in the performances yesterday, every time that door opened, I really winced because I felt someone's barging in here without knocking. So my experience is very uneasy. I was most comfortable with the Baldassare room, and I think that's telling because I felt I could simply look at a task being undertaken rather than the people, and that's possibly worth. You can put me on the couch and work that one through. That I do tend to focus on the act and not the actor. Probably the one that I had most trouble with was Abramovich's combination of arcane ritual and natural history specimen. Somewhere in the middle I found Santiago Sierra, but I was still uneasy because if you stand a war veteran in the corner of a room, aren't you infantilising them? Aren't you calling them the dunce? Aren't you punishing them? Aren't you objectifying them and talking behind their back? Doesn't a war veteran carry a whole complex set of burdens, social, moral and political? The war veteran is the meat in the political sandwich, or the lightning rod, the whipping boy, hero or villain. And the war veteran's status is changing quite significantly. For us here in Australia, the veteran of East Timor has a positive status as a nation builder. The veteran of Afghanistan has negative status for many as a representation of the coalition of the willing. And the lesser veterans, if I may, of regions like Bougainville, who are characterised as regional policemen or the local sheriff. Now, says I, that's what I thought. I took the time to buttonhole one of the participants after he'd finished his shift yesterday to talk to him. And he was interested in what people were saying behind his back as he stood there in the corner, and particularly interested in what the school teachers were saying to students. And he thought through all the metaphors. He was no fool. I mean, he had thought about standing in the corner and being punished and the ostracism that he had experienced on his return from Vietnam. And he and his colleagues had actually taken over the staging a little. They'd adjusted the timing of the shifts to suit them rather than the organisers. And someone hadn't turned up that morning, and they just worked it out amongst themselves. So I thought, you know, the agency was being recovered. And of course, the next shift, the fellow standing in the corner had donned a T-shirt saying, well, you know, war, not war on terrorism, war is terrorism. So the fellow in the corner was speaking back and taking advantage of the platform. That was my gut response, and I guess I'm following Rebecca's Abramovichian method to this extent only, that I'm speaking to you from gut to head. That was my gut feeling. My head feeling is that all of the rooms, and Sierra's in particular, bring forward this ethical schema. And it's one that strikes me as very similar to that of Emmanuel Levinas, who grounded the ideas of ethics in the interconnectivity of subjectivities, that is to say, encountering and engaging with the other. Face to face was his motto. Face to face, the ego is confronted with the mystery of the other. And so is Sierra's room a schema, a diagram of Levinasian ethics. To put it crudely, and I am an amateur in philosophy, is this a moment where strangers cease to be strangers, where in fact starting to know the stranger makes you recognise the strangeness of yourself? That's the other thing that nags me here, and Nina can pick this up. The war veteran states his opinion to me directly, and on that T-shirt, I see the piece as a kind of schematic ethical diagram, implying that art can actually never put you in touch with the ethical. Art always allows you to rehearse the ethical, it draws you a sketch map of the ethical, but much as it would like to be, art never is the ethical. It's always a surrogate or a step towards it. And I leave with a comment that I heard the Irish-English artist Conrad Atkinson make many moons ago. He worked a lot in Northern Ireland, and to paraphrase him and thinking of Sierra's work, the veterans of those wars suffer psychologically, physically, socially. Is it going to do them any good to hear that Santiago Sierra's on the case?
Yes, I absolutely agree with you that it's obviously a very kind of complex, nuanced work, which resists any sort of simple readings or kind of moral dichotomies. And I think the work really hinges on this idea of the question of punishment or protest. I mean, like Chris, I expected to walk into that room and to read this veteran, this sort of decorated war hero, as subjected to a sort of child's punishment, you know, made to stand in the corner, a sort of ritual humiliation being carried out by this absent and invisible authority. But when I entered the room, the guy who was standing there had this T-shirt that Chris described that said "War on Terrorism," and the "on" was obviously crossed out and said "War is terrorism." And instantly the work was actually transformed into an act of kind of silent protest of this sort of gagged but outspoken veteran. And I think that's really interesting because there's the question of the degree to which the subject is allowed to self-represent. And I mean, a bit like Chris, I buttonholed Pollyanna, the project manager for this piece, and asked about the issue of the clothes, whether some of the veterans are dressed in full military dress, others are in fatigues or plain clothes. And she mentioned this guy Jerry with his "War is Terrorism" T-shirt. And apparently he had emailed Pollyanna and said that he wanted to wear this T-shirt. She consulted Santiago, who said, absolutely not, the work is meant to be neutral. And Jerry then replied to say, with all due respect, Santiago, this work isn't neutral. And he actually came round to the idea, which I think is a really sort of interesting anecdote in terms of, it really opens up the readings to the work, and I think makes it far more interesting that he has been allowed to make that sort of mute but very strong point. So they're obviously these kind of faceless and anonymous people, but their individuality is recognised, and their stance and physical presence really speak volumes. Also really important, I think, is this question of guilt and the relationship between power and guilt. You're really looking at, there's the guilt of the subject, the war veteran who's standing in the corner. There's the guilt of the spectator who assumes the responsibility for this burden of how society treats these war veterans. And then there's the guilt of the artist. So we're all implicated in this sort of very problematic and compromised relationship. So I see it very much as a sort of anti-heroic piece in that regard. And there's a really interesting quote that Sierra made about war, which I thought I'd read. He says, "The two professions that I believe are most paradigmatic of work are prostitution and the army. The army is the profession of the future for the masses of unemployed people. They need people for wars. Remember that America has declared war on average once every 18 months. It's also a business, an industry, a social mechanism." So these veterans are very much, instruments. They're kind of stripped of their humanity. They're cogs in a sort of capitalist machine. And I don't know how many of you are sort of familiar with Sierra's practice as a whole, but this work is is relatively tame. So I just wanted to offer a bit of kind of critical context for some of his other pieces. And I thought I'd start by looking at, there's a number of sort of different iterations of this particular veterans piece. It's been performed in museums and projects like this. Photographic documentation has been shown on billboards in Berlin. Editioned artworks have been sold by commercial galleries. He's got a show actually opening in New York this week. So this unique print is sold for $40,000. And I think this is really important. Later we'll return to the sort of privileged position of the artist, but it's important to remember that Sierra himself makes quite a lot of money from these artworks and this sort of subjugation of these people. So his work takes the, much of his work takes the form of what he calls remunerated actions. So he solicits labour to sort of perform objection, paying the vulnerable and dispossessed a minimum wage, to perform acts which are demeaning, degrading, pointless, sometimes physically demanding, and on occasion permanently scarring. And he does his research in each locale. He investigates the minimum wage, who the underclass is, and then he formulates an action in which people are really encouraged to put a price on themselves. So there's this interest in the kind of commodification of human labour. And many of these tasks, as I said, involve sort of relentless subjugation, debasement. He's obviously been accused of the most unscrupulous behaviour on many occasions, almost kind of quasi-criminal in some regards. So just a quick look through a few works, and many of these obviously involve people facing the wall, as with the work downstairs. This is a piece he did in London involving 10 Iraqi workers who were paid to assume these sort of this plastic sheeting and were then sprayed with toxic polyurethane. And this obviously is very reminiscent of the sort of hooded torture victims at Abu Ghraib. This is a piece where he organised people, paid some workers, and then organised them according to their skin colour, light to dark, like a sort of human Pantone chart. This is probably Sierra at his most sadistic, really. These are 4 prostitutes who are addicted to heroin, who are hired for the cost of a shot of heroin to give their consent to be tattooed. So this completely meaningless line was tattooed on their backs. This work I included because it's reminiscent of the Laura Lima piece downstairs. This guy was paid $10 an hour for 360 continuous working hours, which is about 2 weeks, to lie incarcerated behind this brick wall and just receive his meals through the slot you can see. And then finally, a lot of Sierra's antagonism is directed towards a sort of well-heeled, outgoing public. So here you have a young homeless man who's paid to clean visitors' shoes at an art opening. As an aside, this is actually the other Kaldor art project that John did with Santiago in Brisbane in 2010, where people were paid to support these long grids. But I just wanted to make, as an aside, a lot of Santiago's work deploys the sort of minimalist syntax and structure and form of a lot of conceptual practices from the 70s. So you get, all the photographic documentation is this sort of grainy black and white. You get this very plain-spoken title, which is like a sort of title to a conceptual artwork. And then the syntax of these blocks and grids and units, and that's very much associated with American minimalism. But then he takes these, what he calls empty vessels, and invests them with a sort of socio-political critique. So again, this is very reminiscent of sort of the vocabulary of arte povera and the use of materials. We might return to Steve McQueen later, but just very quickly, to put this all in a bit of context, Sierra has been associated with what the British academic Claire Bishop called a practice of relational antagonism. And she positioned this very much in opposition to relational aesthetics, Nicolas Bourriaud's formulation of kind of 1990s participatory art, which attempted to engineer a sort of sense of harmony and community and conviviality with these interactive artworks, and instead relational antagonism in Bishop's formulation seeks to engineer disunity and disharmony and dysfunction, and a real sense of kind of social disease. But it's obviously a very conflicted attitude, because in the course of, Sierra claims he's exposing these sort of social and political injustices and these economic disparities, but obviously in the course of exposing them, he's also perpetrating them. He's restaging what he observes in society, and in the course of doing so reflects inflicts a second humiliation on these subjects. So there's a real problem with reading his politics as kind of radical or progressive. And I think that rather than an ethical art, it's more a sort of very fraught form of bearing witness. He's spectacularizing the social divisions between rich and poor, high and low, the civilized and the grotesque body. And so maybe at this point it would be interesting to kind of broaden the question still further and ask about how credible or authentic an art of this sort is. Are the means compatible with the ends? How compromised is it? Sierra's work can be articulated into positions on the left just as easily as it can be articulated into positions on the right. Is it a sort of redemptive humanitarian project, or is it an absolutely pitiless art of hyperviolence and transgression?
I can only say, my contribution to the experimental framework here is to make the proposition that I don't think art's very good at answering those questions or even asking them. And I'm not here to beat up on Santiago Sierra or any other artist. I'm glad it was you speaking about the Irv, not me. But it seemed to me that 13 Rooms, it's a curious experience to visit tedium, containment, pain, contractual obligation, working against the clock. A lot of
serious exploitation.
Well, I won't even use that word, but there's an air of duress is not quite the right word, but an air of difficulty, to put it euphemistically, in a lot of the works. Now, before I ask anything of an individual artist, I'd ask, what am I doing looking at that? And there's a utilitarian model of ethics, I think, in the art world that says, look, this is all a bit dodgy, but if we just get through the other side, we'll all be better off for it, Or there's the kind of St. Augustine model, he was writing about lying, but you could say it in terms of ethical behaviour. If the artist doesn't think it's unethical, then it can't be unethical, because if you think you're telling the truth, you can't be lying. So if you think you're doing something ethical, you can't be unethical. So we just stop at that point. And I don't personally have an answer, other than to say, for me, the interesting experience with this project has been to have to ask that. And I suppose with the Abramovich work, I did find myself thinking, she is struggling up there, So I thought maybe I was getting to that moment and asking myself, what am I to do with someone who's clearly struggling before my eyes, which is the Levinasian model. That stop worrying about yourself, you don't exist anymore, it's the other person.
And I think Sierra actually is owns up to the ethical compromises in his work. And in that regard, he leaves it very open-ended. He himself has said that he doesn't think it's credible to really practice a kind of politically engaged art, given its immediate consumption by the audience and the market alike. There's a quote here where he says, "There's no possibility that we can change anything with our artistic work. I don't believe in the possibility of change, not in the art context, not in the reality context." So it's quite a nihilistic passivity. But I think what he does do is he throws open, or he resists offering a concrete reading of the work, and he really places the burden of the work's signification and its meaning on the role of the kind of participants. And whether they respond with revulsion or see it as a sort of redemptive project is very much left up to them. And I think in that regard, he's exploring the politics of seeing and representation, and why we want to offer these very intensely moralistic responses to such art, and insisting on taking a bit of responsibility for developing the meanings that circulate around art.
If you just, because we're running out of time, just one image. I just wanted to, just so my comments don't sound sort of utterly pessimistic, I mean, I just wanted to show a different response to the idea of the war veteran or the war dead, which is the British artist Steve McQueen, who designed up postage stamps in exact replica of the Royal Mail model, featuring the faces of all servicemen and women who had died in the Iraq War. And he spoke, so we see the face, not the back of the head. He spoke to the families of the deceased and asked them to choose the image. And then he did, he entered a kind of a civic space, the postage stamp and the idea of public honouring and shared admission of the social contract that other people are dying for us. And then, of course, was told by the Royal Mail to remove the profile of the Queen from these stamps because it was an insult to Her Majesty to be associated with these fake stamps. And you can see in the presentation, it's the presentation that a philatelist would love. So it seems to me you can get out of the room and into the civic space in ways that I think he's in the same territory as Sierra, but he's throwing it back on the people, and I mean that in the civic sense rather than the audience.
Okay, that's it, I'm afraid.